Hello everybody, I'm James Bennett from Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University in the UK. I'm the Principal Investigator for the Trade-offs in Communal Areas of South Africa project funded through BBSRC as part of the Global Challenges Research Fund, GCRF. Now that we're at the end of the 3-year project, the purpose of this presentation is to summarise some of the main findings from the part of the project that Coventry has coordinated. This will be complemented by 3 presentations from other project partners, which will also be available to view on the website. This presentation focuses on 2 key areas reflected in the title. The first is the ongoing importance of the rangeland commons to the livelihoods of people in rural communities in South Africa, both as a means of generating cash income and in-kind subsistence. The second is some of the issues associated with the management of rangeland as a grazing commons, and specifically work Coventry University has undertaken in monitoring and evaluating rangeland resting initiatives in local communities. One of the main ways we captured household engagement with natural resources was through a comprehensive household survey. This was administered at 3 communities within the Umbenyani area, which was the primary area of research for the project. We surveyed about 50 households at each community, representing between 12 and 30% of the total households, or about 20% on average. We adopted a purposive sampling approach, ensuring that the households we surveyed included those who were members of the Grazing Association and therefore had livestock, as well as a range of more marginalised households, including those that were identified as either being poorer, female-headed, or without access to arable land, and often several of those overlapped. A range of very detailed questions were asked covering all aspects of uses made of rangeland resources, as well as engagement of households with existing management initiatives such as conservation agreements brokered through local NGOs. The survey was administered between May and November 2021. So in terms of the overall importance of rangelands to households, I think a key point to make to begin with is that in terms of cash income, they are relatively insignificant. The vast majority of cash income comes from external sources. That's in the form of salaries, pensions, and social grants. And they constitute probably between 75 to 90% of the average cash income into each household, and in some cases up to 100%. But this is not to say that rangelands don't remain important to households. They have critical importance in terms of cultural significance and also in terms of subsistence value, in terms of the in-kind income that accumulates to households through income they don't need to spend to buy things. And if we look at the way that households that were surveyed ranked these relative importances, then it was pretty consistent across all 3 communities. So number 1 rank was, unsurprisingly, livestock production. This has been corroborated by several other studies, and livestock production is the one rangeland use that actually does generate household income for most households. Second was water provision. Third was timber products, and by that we include both timber for household construction as well as fuel wood. Fourth was cultural services, which we'll elaborate more on later. And fifth was non-timber products. That's a pretty broad church in terms of aggregates for brick manufacture, for example, thatching grass, medicinal herbs, and wild foods. So I'm now going to discuss in more detail each of the 5 uses of rangeland I highlighted in the previous slide, beginning with livestock production. So the focus in this slide will be on income from livestock sales, but it's important to emphasize that for many households, particularly poorer households with smaller herds, livestock continue to play a really important cultural and subsistence role, even if income from sales is infrequent. For the purposes of this slide, we're focusing on households who are able to sell livestock regularly, and that basically means sell annually. So the table shows that we are summarizing information for the three villages A, B and C, and the second column indicates the proportion of households who are able to sell livestock regularly, basically on an annual basis. And that varies between 12% at village C up to as much as 41% of households at village A, where there seems to be much more of a focus on livestock production. In terms of mean sales income realized through these, or mean annual sales income realized through these livestock sales, it's between as little as 3,000 per year at village B and as much as 16,000 or just over at village A. Although that masks quite a lot of difference. If you look at village A in terms of range of sales achieved, it's anything between 1,000 per annum up to as much as 105,000 per annum. And in terms of the proportion of total household income being contributed, cash income being contributed by livestock sales, that varies between about 10 and 21%. And that's also captured in this graph below. The blue bar being total income within the household. This is the average, and the orange bar, the income from livestock. But these income levels from livestock sales also capture, or mask I should say, quite a bit of difference between households. There are many households, for example, where somebody has retired and has invested all of their pension into livestock production, where the proportion of income realized from livestock sales might be as much as 60 or 70%. But importantly, if we ask the question, who are the people making most of these sales or from livestock, then the overwhelming answer to this is these are male-headed households. In very few cases are female-headed households able to make regular livestock sales and generate household income. So this just kind of contributes to the narrative about female-headed households being more marginalized. So the second most important use of rangeland identified from the household survey was in terms of provision of water. And this is obviously a critical resource to all communities and is particularly important because it's free. No household needs to pay for this. So in terms of provision for people and livestock, it's of critical importance. In terms of how the different communities accessed water, then for two communities, the majority of households collected water from a stem pipe, and at the third community, the majority of collection came from natural springs. But interestingly, all three communities identified supply as the key constraint to water provision. And that was really in terms of two things. The first was potential breakdowns in infrastructure associated with pipes and standpipes, but also variation in the ability of rangeland to actually be able to supply water. And that might be because of drought, but also importantly because of invasive species like wattle, which are particularly thirsty and soak up a lot of water. So this is interesting because both livestock production in terms of presence of wattle on rangeland and water provision, these two important aspects of provisioning services identified by households, are both compromised by the presence of invasive wattle trees in these areas. But as we'll see in subsequent slides, the case isn't always a negative one. So a good example of where wattle can be seen as beneficial is in the provision of timber and fuel wood for local communities. So it was clear from the social survey we undertook that almost all households were engaging in collection of both timber and fuel wood. So in the table I've got in the slide, if we look first at timber, then 95 to 100% of households said they collected timber, mainly on a less than monthly basis, and the primary species used was wattle, either silver or black wattle. And for fuel wood, it was even more ubiquitous, so 100% of households collected fuel wood, done mainly weekly and primarily on wattle with a little bit of indigenous woodland as well. And the key benefit here is in the amount of money foregone in terms of cost. So what would be needed to be spent if bundles of firewood or fuel wood were purchased. And typically a bundle of fuel wood is around £300 to £900 per month in terms of cost. So for the majority of households, this saving equates to between 4 and 10,000 rand per annum, which is a huge amount for a relatively poor household. So this underlines the critical importance of wattle to households and this kind of antagonistic relationship they have to resolve around wattle. These kind of trade-offs that need to be resolved in terms of provisioning services in the household. So, you know, a male-headed household where the man has an interest in livestock production which is compromised by wattle, but at the same time wattle is being used by that person to construct their corral, to build their house, etc. And likewise for women, you know, fuel wood is critically of importance, and they are the primary collectors of fuel wood, but at the same time wattle compromises their safety. So it just underlines this whole set of trade-offs that have to be resolved even within provisioning services. Another interesting point here is that there are a proportion of the households who do purchase quite a lot of their fuel wood. So this just underlines that there is a market, a local sales market for this, and in fact one or two entrepreneurial people are making quite a bit of money from this. Another important value of rangeland to local households was in terms of the cultural services they provided, and these aren't easily valued monetarily, but are nonetheless of fundamental importance to most households in aspects of their everyday lives. And this manifested itself in three main ways that were mentioned. The first was in the provision of initiation ceremonies on rangeland, which is where boys moved into manhood, and that's often associated with the construction of initiate huts, which often involve the use of things like thatching grass and also timber for their construction. The second one that was mentioned was sacred spaces for ancestors, for engagement with ancestors, and these might involve, for example, areas of water on rangeland or areas of indigenous forest. And finally, there was also a broader general connection with nature that people felt when they were engaged in activities on rangeland, such as herding livestock or collection of resources. So the final key use mentioned by households in association with rangeland was the collection of non-timber products, and these again were primarily things which were used for subsistence rather than the generation of cash income. And five main uses were highlighted. The first and probably most popular was collection of soil or aggregate for building or the manufacture of bricks. The second was collection of medicinal herbs, of which there is a whole range which are culturally important on the rangeland. The third was dung, which was used still by many households for creating floors and for lining the insides of walls in new dwellings. The fourth was wild food collection, and interestingly, ranked last was thatching grass. But this doesn't seem to necessarily reflect its lack of importance, but more the fact that households were unable to collect thatching grass locally. So quite a bit of use was still made of it, particularly for initiate huts, but households had to travel further afield to collect the resource because it wasn't available locally. So this did raise some interesting questions which we brought into the final workshop, which were about, you know, alternative scenarios of management where thatching grass might be more readily available locally, and if this would be to be valuable. So in summary, it's clear from this very brief overview that households continue to rely on rangelands to provide them with a range of cultural and provisioning services, particularly from a subsistence perspective. However, these uses create potential trade-offs, not only between different provisioning services, particularly those associated with wattle, as we've seen earlier, but also between provisioning services and the less tangible ecosystem services, so-called regulating and supporting services, such as biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and soil fertility. They also create trade-offs between different actors, such as local communities and governmental actors responsible for delivering environmental policy. From a governmental perspective, communities are seen as stewards of rangeland, with a duty to take care of them so the broader ecosystem services they provide can benefit society. The grazing of livestock, particularly when unregulated, is one local activity with potential negative consequences for these broader services. So efforts by local NGOs are underway to see if rangeland can be collectively rested to generate wins for both people and environment. And this is a kind of nice segue into the next section of the presentation. So picking up from here, the second part of this presentation provides an overview of the work we have undertaken to monitor and evaluate rangeland resting initiatives that have been brokered by NGOs at local communities. By way of explanation, these initiatives are constructed within a payments for ecosystem services framework and follow the same basic approach at all three communities we studied. This involves the co-creation of a conservation agreement, or CA, which forms a written document setting out how rangeland should be managed to provide increased environmental services in return for livelihood benefits provided by the NGO. And the basic approach adopted is to firstly establish a grazing association, or GA, as the institution responsible for enacting the conservation agreement at each community, and the GA is then responsible for the day-to-day management of the resource. So one of its first roles is to designate the rested area, and these vary in size between around 70 and 200 hectares. And the basic management approach is to rest each of these areas for a period of 6 months, generally in the growing season between November and the end of April, and then to open them up for grazing from the beginning of May through to the end of October during the dry season. And in return for these environmental services that are rendered through this resting, the NGO delivers livelihood assistance in the form of periodic mobile auctions and the livestock vaccination program. The mobile livestock auctions are a market-based payment scheme which attempts to solve the perceived problem of limited community engagement with mainstream livestock markets by providing periodic auctions for willing sellers from the communities. In contrast, the vaccination program, which is specifically for cattle, is a service provided by the NGOs at cost to them and enables anyone who is a member of the GA to have their cattle vaccinated. So in terms of the monitoring work we undertook at each of these three communities, I guess an important point to make to begin with is that the catalyst for this was the focus group discussions we had at the very beginning of the project in each of the communities, where it became very clear, very apparent that all of these communities were having difficulty in complying with the conservation agreements, and this generally manifested itself as lots of cattle being present on the rangeland when it was supposed to be rested. So in response to this, we initiated in November 2020 a monitoring protocol, basically consisting of two key components. So the first was a weekly count of livestock numbers on the rested areas. So we counted all of the cattle, sheep, goats, horses, etc. every week all the way through the rested period and the unrested period at all three communities. And in conjunction with this, we monitored the accumulation of biomass on these rested areas by the installment of exclosures, which you can see in the top picture. So these are 5 by 5 meter fenced areas that are basically allow forage to accumulate to its absolute potential. And we compared these exclosure areas, which are basically controls, with adjacent sampling areas, also 5 by 5 meters, but which were potentially open to grazing if livestock trespassed. And we did this at 3 random sites within each of the rested areas and at all three communities. And we compared those measurements with areas of unrested rangeland. We also, at a later stage in 2021, initiated a set of focus groups at each of the three communities with the grazing associations to begin to work through some of the constraints and difficulties they were experiencing with compliance from a kind of qualitative perspective as well. So one issue which is important to understand because it might have a key bearing on compliance is actual membership within communities of the grazing associations. And from the figures we managed to gather, summarized in the table, what was absolutely clear at all these communities was that membership was relatively low. So of the total number of households which we had recorded at each community, only between 9 and 14% were actually members of the grazing association. And if you consider that most households, probably at least 50%, have livestock, this means that most households with livestock were not members of the grazing association. So it became important to begin to understand why that was, and the household survey we undertook gave us a good snapshot of some of these reasons. So one of the key reasons reported by between 45 and 55% of all the people who said they weren't members of the grazing association was that they didn't have any livestock, which is, I guess, on face value an obvious conclusion, but it does represent something of a misconception about the role of grazing associations, in that their remit is supposed to go beyond just livestock and be more inclusive in terms of any involvement with rangeland. Other people said they were unaware of the grazing association and its remit, but this was a highly variable response, varying between some communities saying that everybody was aware, up to others saying about 50% were unaware of the role of the grazing association. Others said that they were unwilling or were not able to pay membership fees. And another important point that was made was that the grazing association does not support any activities beyond livestock. And this also extends to the incentives that are provided as part of the payments for ecosystem services approach. So all of the incentives are cattle focused, either through mobile auctions or provision of vaccinations. If you don't have cattle, then there are no incentives to be part of the grazing association. And it's important to understand this because this does have a very strong bearing on the kinds of compliance that we're seeing. So in terms of the evidence we accumulated for compliance with the resting and grazing protocols at each community, we have evidence in terms of weekly livestock counts, indicated by this graph here, and seasonal accumulation of biomass, indicated by this graph here. We've only presented data for a single community, but the patterns we observed at all three communities are quite similar. So firstly, if we talk about the livestock count data, these data are presented as animal units, and the area to the left of the black arrow is basically the point at which the rested area was closed to grazing, and the area to the right of it is when it was open to grazing. So the first thing you can see, which is immediate, is that the animal numbers were at their highest when the area was officially closed to grazing. So there was lots of trespassing animals on this closed area. In fact, average livestock counts were around 20 to 30 animal units in total, or about 0.1 to 0.3 animal units per hectare, which is probably equivalent to a commercial stocking rate in the area. And that was when it was officially supposed to be closed. After the point at which it was opened, interestingly, animal numbers dropped off completely and remained low throughout most of that dry season. So what we're hypothesizing is happening here is that animals are essentially free ranging and are moving onto this area when the forage is at its best quality, and then moving off and grazing elsewhere once the forage quality and possibly the amount has declined. In terms of measured change in seasonal biomass, then the key thing to look at with this graph is the comparisons between the orange and the blue lines and between the orange and the grey lines. So at the start of the growing season in November 2020, all of these areas which were being measured had very similar starting points in terms of their biomass. The blue line indicates the amount of biomass accumulated in the exclosure areas, the caged areas we mentioned in the protocol, and the orange area is the amount of biomass accumulated in the adjacent plots, the 5 by 5 meter plots being measured next door. So what's quite obvious from this is that from a very similar starting point, very quickly you get a divergence in terms of, on the rested area, in terms of the amount of biomass being measured, the orange line, and the potential accumulation being measured in those cages. And the difference by the end of the season is in the order of 1.5 to 2 tons per hectare, so very significant. In contrast, if you compare those areas that weren't exclosed but were being measured in the rested area with the areas outside the rested area in just the general rangeland, then there is very little difference in the amount of accumulated biomass throughout the season. So really, in essence, those areas accessible to grazing on the rested area were accumulating no more biomass than was accumulated in other areas that weren't part of the resting program, which obviously has implications for the performance of the resting protocol. When we explored further using both the household survey and focus groups the reasons for this non-compliance, the majority, greater than 50% of livestock owners who were not part of the grazing associations at each community admitted not complying with the grazing rules, and they were very honest about this. The most frequently cited reason for non-compliance was a lack of awareness of the grazing rules amongst GA non-members, although why and how true this is difficult to determine. There was certainly also a sense, at least at one of the communities, that the rules were being deliberately transgressed by livestock owners who were either politically at odds with people who were part of the GA committee or who were simply unwilling to accept any regulation as to where they graze their livestock. More broadly, GAs at all communities do not feel empowered to sanction non-members, particularly if cattle are from outside the community, for rule transgressions. They might be accused of stealing animals if they attempt to impound them, and so limit their actions to herding trespassing livestock away from the rested area. And this underlines a cross-cutting issue of a lack of authority of local institutions in these circumstances, with diminished power of traditional leadership. So the other important aspect of the payments for ecosystem services approach, which frames these conservation agreements with local communities, is the payments of livelihoods benefits that accumulate to grazing association members. One aspect of this is the opportunity to sell cattle through periodic mobile auctions at the communities. We're only able to present data for Umvenyani as a whole in terms of the sale figures we have, but we do have data from 2017 and 2019 for 3 separate auction events. So to try and give an indication per village, I've averaged those data across the number of villages that participated. And the figures we come up with when we do this are, on average, per auction event per village, there were 7 sellers, of whom 83% were male, or around 6 out of 7 of the sellers, and 17%, or around 1 of the 7 sellers, were female. And on average, those sellers sold 2.6 cattle per sales event at an average price per animal of just under 6,000 rand. So this equated to around 15 to 20,000 rand per sales event per household, and a total of around 15 to 20 animals per village being sold at each of these events. So when we reflect on these sales numbers, it's probably fair to say that auctions do offer a useful opportunity which can be built on to sell, particularly when local markets might be slack in between peak sales times at Christmas and around circumcision, events which usually occur in July. But it's clear that there are far fewer animals being sold into these mobile auctions than could potentially be achieved. I mean, if you just look at the numbers of sellers in comparison to the numbers of GA members, which is often 30 or 40 per village, it's well below, and well below the number of people with livestock at each of these communities. So why is that? So there are two potential reasons. The first is the sales price being realized, and the value of just under 6,000 rand per animal is quite considerably below, 20 to 30% below what can potentially be achieved in these communities by selling it into the informal market, the local market. So it might be that many people are taking a decision to hold back with their animals and hold them for Christmas time or circumcision rituals when they're likely to achieve higher prices, if they can do this. The other aspect you've got to think about is the actual size of the herds that most people at the GAs or members of the GAs have, and many of them have herd size that are simply too small to be able to make regular sales. The other thing we can reflect on as well is how much these mobile auctions are able to level up in terms of disparities between men and women, for example. And it's clear that only 1 in 7 of these sellers are still female. Another interesting line of evidence we have is we asked the question in the household survey, why are you primarily a member of the Grazing Association? And it was interesting that only 7% of respondents ranked auctions as the primary reason for them joining the Grazing Association. So there's clearly a lot of other more important reasons why people would rather be a member of the Grazing Association. And it might be that people think that a local market for sales is already there, so it's just less of a priority for them. So the other important payment which accumulates to Grazing Association members is livestock vaccination. So all cattle belonging to Grazing Association members are vaccinated at each community annually by NGO staff using a broad spectrum antibiotic. And this is a really effective intervention which is valued by the community members because it deals with a key constraint they identify. In the household survey we conducted, one of the major limitations to livestock production which was identified was animal health. So it's also inclusive because, unlike the mobile auctions, it supports all stock owners regardless of herd size. Even if you've only got 3 or 4 animals, they will all be vaccinated. And it was interesting because in the household survey, when people were asked about their primary motivation for joining the Grazing Association, vaccination was ranked as the primary reason by 89% of respondents. So it was way above all the other factors such as mobile auctions, a desire to improve the health of the rangeland, etc. The downside of this is that even with subsidization through payment of membership fees at each of the grazing associations, this comes at cost to the NGO. It's not a market-based solution, or it's not a market-based service. So there's a cost in terms of the purchase of the antibiotic, and particularly in terms of the time that's allocated by NGO staff members to go around all of these communities annually undertaking this vaccination program. So in conclusion, on the basis of the data we have collected so far, it's clear that these resting initiatives are unlikely to be delivering expected environmental gains and only partially delivering social gains. So we can ask the question, is the PES model appropriate in its current form in these communities? Can we, for example, rethink the model for support in different ways? So might it be possible to disconnect encouragement to rest rangeland from the need to offer incentives at all, given that historically communities did this anyway? Equally, is it possible to continue to provide appropriate support to some communities, for example in the form of subsidized livestock vaccination, even without recognized environmental compliance? Certainly, if the current model is to find greater success, then grazing associations have to focus on two things. Firstly, increasing their membership, potentially by making what they are trying to achieve much more visible in communities. Also, and relatedly, increasing the attractiveness of being a GA member, for example by expanding the remit to include all livestock owners, potentially by increasing the benefit mechanisms beyond cattle to include all livestock. So a thank you to particularly the funders who help support this project, and they're listed at the bottom of this slide, but also and importantly to the 3 communities who participated in this research, provided their time in terms of data collection, interviews, focus groups, and general commitment to support the project. If you want more detail on the project, then please visit the website, where you'll find, in addition to this presentation, the presentation from the other project partners as well. Thank you.